Arcanum's pretty neat, right? Like, you get these cool magic powers that are big and flashy and super action-packed, some really, like, anime stuff, yeah? And then you get some Arcanum that are just really gonna mess you up, and that's what we're gonna be looking at today. Now, when I say mess you up, I mean this is some seriously life-altering stuff, right? We have Arcanum that will just straight up kill you if it's overused, or it might mind break you, or wipe your mind and install God instead, or it might be merciful and just blow up your lungs. You never really know with this sort of thing. The one thing we do know is that the unifying factor between all of these is that they are all sort of hereditary, right? They are familial abilities. They are passed down through the lineage, bloodline arcanum, if you will. Yeah. And I think that this correlation is more than just coincidental. I think that there are two primary reasons why this manner of arcanum sort of tends to manifest in this really self-destructive pattern. The first is simply that the arcanum has just become too strong for the physical form. It is too unwieldy to fully use without significant kickback for the user, right? Now, we know that the arcanists tend to become stronger the older and, the purer their lineage is, right? And it could simply be that an arcanum that was originally benign begins to sort of take on this more severe toll on the body the more powerful it gets, right? The further down the line you go, the harder it becomes to control. And I would like to circle back to this point in a bit, but for now we're going to go ahead and move on to option 2, with that being that it isn't necessarily the Arcanum causing the trouble. Because if we really take a look at these cases that we have so far, the Arcane ability is more an accessory to the damage rather than the actual underlying cause, right? Like, yes, the Arcanum is causing damage, but what is kind of really spurring it on is something more, I guess, insidious, you could say, right? With this underlying cause being misuse or extreme use of the Arcanum. And this is something that might be unwittingly done or, actually purposely perpetrated for some greater good type reason. So in terms of Arcanist, a long and identifiable bloodline tends to mean a family of greater prestige, right? And a family of greater prestige tends to mean that their services are in demand more often, or that they occupy important positions, even in societies that sort of tend to shun those with Arcanist blood. We see this in Vienna, where even if Arcanists are treated almost as second-class citizens, prominent families like the Dietersdorfs are still highly vaunted. We've also seen that prestigious families will often very heavily fixate on either maintaining their prestige or else reclaiming it if they have somehow lost it. The Mesmers are a great example of this, considering how they basically indoctrinate their children, forcing them to take up the family profession from a young age in order to maintain their superiority. And I mean, this is particularly harrowing, seeing as the family profession tends to sort of take the form of exposing them to the subconscious of the mentally unwell. When Mesmer Jr. had started doing this, she was 12, and I mean, look at her now, right? On the other hand, if they have particularly unruly or uncooperative progeny, such as in Scott's case, they just disavow them entirely and have them locked up. And I mean, even then, right, in his dying notes, Scott still professes this great pride in the Mesmer name, despite everything that it had done to him. Mesmer Jr. still sees her family as the pinnacle of innovation and intelligence. If anything, she blames herself for her own dysfunctions rather than, tarnish the family name. There is this very heavy focus on maintaining social standing at all costs, even at, personal expense. And I mean, again, right, look at the Dietersdorfs. They basically batter their mental health by inviting spirits in order to sort of uphold this family prestige, right? In order to be that prodigious actress or singer or painter or whatever. They would opt for personal destruction rather than fail their lineage. In some cases, it's duty that would cause an arcanist to overtax themselves. Sixes must take up the mantle and lead a Pyrrhon regardless of whatever personal deficits this may incur upon them, right? Not that they have a whole lot of choice in the matter. We do get the sense that a 6 caught unaware or unprepared by the revelation's descent runs the risk of having their personality wiped or the self subsumed by something greater. And I mean, even without that, we know for a fact that 6s tend to live very, very short lives as it is. In London, the Fogwalkers, Oliver Fogg and his family, must cleanse the air for the safety of the public, regardless of the impact that this is going to have on their physical health, right? Regardless of if it causes eventual death like it did with Oliver's father. The immediate cause of all of these ailments are Arcanum, but the underlying cause is something a little bit more complex, right? The pressures of the environment leads them to misuse or overuse their Arcanum to the point of causing extreme detriment. The only real outlier here is Eric, as the use of her Arcanum is pretty explicitly killing her, even just passively, right? And if you didn't read through her anecdote, she basically has the rage virus, right? She's got parasites in her blood that make her strong and violent, and her mother had it and her grandfather had it. Now, albeit we do have proof that this wouldn't necessarily wind up terminal, if it was properly managed, as her grandfather did manage to live to a very ripe old age before he was slaughtered by the Manus. Though we do also know that the proper regulation requires the use of external tools, which is the ring on her arm. As a side note, do consider reading this anecdote. I think it's one of the best of the batches by a very, very large margin. I would say it's tied for the best side story in the game, along with Six's. Now, on the topic of Eric, I wanted to circle back to the first idea that the Arcanum is simply too strong or unwieldy for the user to fully utilize without harm. Now, one way that we can look at Arcanists, and one way that the story seems to paint them, is as this allegory for, neurodivergence. It is pretty frequently reiterated that Arcanists simply do not function on the same wavelength of normalcy that we would consider for humans, or in other words, they are atypical. And this is more obvious in mannerisms and actions in some than others. Take, for example, Joshua or Marcus. They both display several traits that could be easily attributed to some manner of neurodivergence. And this leads me to think that there are other possible parallels that we can draw on as well. One of which being that of hereditary conditions. And before we get into this next section, I would really just like to make it abundantly clear that I am not a doctor or psychologist. I'm just a dude who thinks too much and has access to Google, right? So take it all with a grain of salt and don't yell at me. Now, Eric's condition is very explicitly stated to be hereditary, and this made me think of similarities between these Bloodline Arcanum and, hereditary illness as a whole. Now, if we go through the list, right, we have the Dietersdorfs, who commune with the dead, and they hear voices and undergo significant changes in personality when they use their Arcanum, right? And I think this is a pretty clear stand-in for something like schizophrenia, which is a hereditary condition, or at least very commonly a hereditary condition. We have the Mesmers, and Mesmer Jr. specifically, who has very, very heavily implied OCD, if you read through her stories and her voice lines. Obsessive compulsive order is also generally a hereditary trait. It tends to run in families more often than not. We have the Fogwalkers, Oliver Fogg and his father, and while their ailments seem to stem more from the environment as opposed to being an intrinsic part of their Arcanum, they still could be seen as sort of a stand-in for, genetic pulmonary diseases like asthma or cystic fibrosis. And then we have Six. Now, I'm still on the fence with the whole revelation thing. It could be an Arcanum passed down through blood, or it could be a result of a Pyrrhon's ritual, which, if you don't know what I'm talking about. Regardless, I think the fact that the revelation might delete your personality, as well as the fact that this can seemingly be staved off by learning things, leads me to think that it may be a stand-in for dementia, particularly early onset, as, again, Sixes are noted to have very, very short lifespans. Now, while dementia in general isn't necessarily genetic, the common factor is age, certain types of early onset Alzheimer's are. Particularly, familial Alzheimer's is very strongly correlated to genetics and can show up as early as one's 30s, right? Which kind of fits with Sixes and their whole thing, yeah? On top of all of that, you also have the logistics of keeping bloodlines pure. We know that Arcanist populations are generally very sporadic and self-contained. They haven't really had the prolific spread that humans enjoy. Which is to say, when it comes to procreation, the options just aren't really there, right? Eventually, over the course of several centuries or even millennia, keeping a bloodline pure may not necessarily even be a deliberate choice. It might just be the only choice they have due to seclusion. And this could inevitably lead to, let's say, intermingling within the same gene pool, which we know can lead to some pretty severe conditions down the line if it's done long enough. But which theory do I think is more likely, right? I think it's a little bit from column A and a little bit from column B, right? I think genetics and inheritance definitely play a part here. The Arcanum is undoubtedly powerful, and there are definitely kickbacks that are a direct consequence of usage. But I mean, a large role of it is just how that particular Arcanum is utilized, right? If regulated properly and used in moderation, there's really no reason why most of these couldn't be just as benign as their non-bloodline counterparts. Even the channeling with the Dietersdorfs, it basically messed up everyone in the family who had it, right? But at the end of the day, it's not all that different from, say, shamane channeling nature spirits or necrologists communing with the dead. The issue is that they are encouraged to overwork themselves, the good of the whole at the expense of the individual. I think it is a sort of a combination of these two factors that kind of lead to this really destructive use of the Arcanum, and this really detrimental effect on the user. But that's gonna be about it, I think. The topic's a little bit more, I suppose, random and freeform than the stuff I usually do, but it was something that was brought up during a stream of the story, and I kind of wanted to make a video on it, so here we are. In any case, if you have watched the video, if you've stuck around till the end, if you're still here, thank you very much for showing up. Thank you for watching. I very much appreciate it, and I will see you for the next one. All right, bye bye.